So I couldn't decide what to talk about today because I keep having to skip topics every day because there's always so many things to talk about on any given day. And I'm tired of doing that, so I'm just going to throw everything that I can into one. Electricity in France is up to 1,000 euros per megawatt hour. There is officially now a price cap on Russian oil. Nord Stream 1 has been completely shut down. The S&P 500 is down 18.5%. There was a jobs report on Friday, which I didn't even mention. Normally, I always cover non-farm payroll reports on the day they come out. That was, the headline number was better than expected. This, of course, is not good if you are looking for the Fed to cut rates, because Powell even said, you know what, we need to see a softening of the labor market. So, in fact, when it comes to the jobs report, headline good news is actually bad news. And then, of course, we have the ongoing implosion of the American political system, which is just on an absolute cascading decline into irrelevancy. The glass mask of American politics, the so-called, typical, partisan charade, slipped a long time ago, and the mask shattered once and for all. I think back in 2016. And so we've got all this stuff going on at once, and it all is interrelated. It all affects one another. And I think this is very much a classic not being able to see the forest through the trees situation that I'm caught in, that all of us are caught in. But even if you're conscious that you can't, of being in the forest, you're still not going to be able to see the forest through the trees. You look around, you always see your trees, and these are the trees I'm seeing. I'm seeing the S&P down 18.5%. I'm seeing the Fed hiking rates into a depression. I'm seeing the Europeans completely sabotage their own economies, their own societies. They're not just putting their economies into recession. They are shredding the fabric of their economy, which enables the existence of their society. Everywhere around me, around the world, I look, I see the West in collapse. Even outside of the West itself, the West is collapsing in influence. The third world rightfully does not take the West seriously these days, or at least not compared to how things were a couple years ago, or certainly not how they were 20 years ago. But then again, I am a perennial pessimist. I always see the worst in the news, especially when it comes to economics. Back in 2020, when we had the lockdowns, I said, oh my gosh, this is it. People don't realize how bad things are about to get. And they were bad. But society did not collapse. We were able to endure. There was a lot of bad stuff that happened. We're a lot worse off for what happened. We certainly haven't recovered from what happened. But nevertheless, we still exist. But, I'm wrong to say that, because the damage was not avoided. The damage was deferred. I think that's been totally clear. The inflation is part of that. That is clear. And so it's wrong for me to say, well, we were able to outrun the devastation of the lockdowns, and so therefore we might outrun the devastation of all of these combined crises, any one of which could be enough to collapse the Western economies, whether it be the self-imposed energy crisis, the Fed having to raise interest rates, the inflation, the collapse of the stock market. Of course, all these things are interconnected. They're not necessarily happening, and actually none of them are happening independent of one another. But there's always the chicken or the egg question with any one of these things. And I think it's safe to say there will need to be a lot of really good scholarship in the future by historians to really try and parse, particularly economic historians, because historians, by and large, do not understand economics very well. They are relatively ignorant of economics, and when mainline historians try to explain economic problems or economic periods from the past, they kind of do a terrible job, which is where a good, properly trained economic historians come in and do a better job, although oftentimes they still do a bad job. Because this is some tough stuff to try and sort through as it's happening. But it'll be tough even 20, 30 years from now, after all is said and done, I think, to look back at this period at 2022. 2020 to the end of this collapse, that whole period, it's going to take a lot of reasoning. And so I don't think that people should overlook the fact that we are living in such extraordinary times. Hell, the disconnect between the household and the establishment surveys in the non-farm payroll report, and it is in and of itself a very interesting historical phenomenon that we're witnessing. There's a gap now, I think, by Zero Hedge's count of 1.6 million jobs. That's the difference between the household and the establishment survey right now. A few months ago, I think like in March of this year, there was a big disconnect between the establishment survey, which is that headline number that you hear, like 315,000 is what it was this week, for the past month. That has been disconnected from the household survey. And what that means is that companies are hiring more people. There are jobs being created, but you don't have any more people actually working. Because the non-farm payroll report, it's basically a poll. And when it's broken down into the establishment survey versus the household survey, it's two polls. Just like you have these pollsters who, cold call people, call you on your landline and say, hey, are you going to vote for Trump or Biden? The Labor Department, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, calls up households and they call up establishments, and they ask the establishments, hey, have you been hiring or firing lately? How many people have you hired or fired on net? Then they call up households and they say, hey, are you working or are you unemployed? And what we see here is that the Labor Department has been calling up lots of establishments, and the establishments are saying, oh yeah, we're hiring people. But the households are saying, nope, we don't have any new job. The people who were unemployed before are still saying, yep, I'm unemployed. And the people who were employed before are still saying, yep, I'm employed. And so the easiest explanation for that is that you just have the same people taking on multiple jobs to try and scrape by. In normal times, when there wasn't so much going on in the world, I think there would be a lot more people looking at this question and trying to figure this out and figure out what's going on. Because it is a very interesting quirk of the data. It's indicative of, something that's not super healthy, which is that people are having to take on multiple jobs just to get by, and that more people, an increasing percentage of the population, is having a record percentage of the population, is having to take on multiple jobs just to get by. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, what is the U.S. administration and the U.S. media concerned about? They're concerned about MAGA Americans threatening democracy. This is what they're concerned about. They're concerned about people being loyal to the current political regime. They have no concern for, real-world problems. They're concerned with these abstractions, with loyalty to the state. It's truly bizarre when you look at what's in the news, what's going on, what the objectively biggest issues of the day are, and then you listen to Joe Biden's so-called soul of the nation speech. A lot of people are looking at that speech and saying, oh, that's an empire in decline, that's a regime that's losing its grip on power, bitterly trying to cling to its relevancy. But what I look at that is, and to me, that is just a regime that is disconnected from reality. I try and think, objectively. Like if I were in their position and I had their goals and their interests, how would I act? And consistently, the leaders of our regime, of the regime that controls the United States, does not act in that way. They do not. They act against their own interests. They're just stupid, or beyond stupid. They're deranged, and it's very dangerous when you have deranged human beings in control of regimes that have access to nuclear weapons. The United States, I believe, has the second largest nuclear stockpile on Earth. I believe Russia is still number one. And it's not just in the U.S., but across the entirety of the West. You have Annalena Baerbock this past week saying that Germans will continue to suffer for the sake of Ukraine, as if making Germans suffer makes the lives of Ukrainians any better. But this is the ideology, that they must make their people suffer, and their people must enjoy it. Or else what? Who knows? Then you have Liz Truss, the heir apparent to the British throne. Of course, I mean that somewhat facetiously. Of course, she's going to be the prime minister, not the queen, but the prime minister who has all the power. And she has made it abundantly clear. She was asked directly in a debate, and she replied, followed by thunderous applause, that she is fully prepared, she is ready and willing to use nuclear weapons because it is her duty as the prime minister to use nuclear weapons, presumably against Russia. Russia, who, as I said just a moment ago, I believe has the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet. So I think we're living in times very easily, this should not be a controversial statement, far more dangerous than at any point during the Cold War, which is absurd. It's inexcusable. It's disgusting. Or what was the trio of words, of adjectives that they used? I think it was disgraceful, disgusting, despicable. I think it went Henry, James, then Gordon. I should, if I actually was a real YouTuber and I did like editing and I put in clips, I should just put in that clip of those three saying, disgraceful, despicable, disgusting, because it would have fit perfectly there. That's the situation we're in. There is no one competent nor even rational at the levers of power anywhere in the world. Not at the Fed, not at the White House, not at 10 Downing Street, not in, what is the French presidential palace these days? It's not the Tuileries. The Tuileries burned down. I think that was where Napoleon lived, was the Tuileries. I know it's not the Louvre, because that's a museum now. The French have too many palaces in Paris. I can't keep up with them. But wherever the French president lives, that guy's not rational, though he is the most rational in Europe. The Chancellery in Berlin is not occupied by serious people. The Italians might get better. There is a decent chance that after the next election, the Italians have some commonsensical leadership, and they will be free of this unelected central banker, Mario Draghi. There are people out in the streets in Italy burning their electric bills, just like they are in Scotland, and in England, I presume, and all over Europe. I mean, who would have thought that Europeans in 2022 would be bankrupted by their electric bills? And it's not just electricity, it's also gas and other fuels, diesel and what they call petrol over there. All of these fossil fuels that we're told just to do without. I look at the West today, and I compare it to the Eastern Bloc on the cusp of the collapse of communism in the late 80s. And I think to myself, was it really worse in Russia back in 1987 than it is today in Great Britain or in Germany? were the Ruskies really struggling that much? Were the East Germans struggling that much? I mean, I know that there were certainly very, very bad periods, far worse than anything we've experienced yet in the West, of famine and a lack of just basic goods in the Eastern Bloc. That is sort of a basic characteristic of communism. But by the 80s, was there anything really that bad? I mean, I know Yugoslavia collapsed, but that was sort of independent, although it was related, but it was not directly caused by, it was not directly related to what was going on in the Warsaw Pact countries. Yugoslavia had a financial crisis because it was being bankrolled by the West, and the West realized, hey, the Soviets are kind of on their way out. We don't need to continue to prop up Yugoslavia, and they allowed Yugoslavia to devolve into the 1990s. But what I'm getting at here is that I think that the Eastern Bloc in the late 80s collapsed under less pressure than what the West is going to be feeling over the next several months or years. I think that the West is going to go through a far worse time on a relative basis. We still might be, at the end of this, after the dust settles, we might still be richer, and I certainly hope so. We will be richer than the Eastern Europeans of the late 80s, but I think we will have fallen a lot farther from our peak. And that level of stress, that drop in living standards, is not healthy for a political system. And the Western leadership knows this too, on a very basic level. You have Annalena Baerbock talking about how she knows Germans are going to be out in the streets. They're going to riot over the abject poverty that they've been forced into, and she's saying she doesn't care. Joe Biden is talking about how these MAGA Republicans, anyone who doesn't vote for Joe, the translation there, they are a threat to democracy. What he means is people who do not consent to his administration are threats to the regime itself, and that they are fearing an uprising. People will revolt against losing their livelihood, against losing their homes, against losing access to basic utilities because the price has gone up so much. And I don't know how that plays out. I could make really broad predictions here. I know it's going to be bad, but there's so many variables. What direction is this going to go depends on the order in which events occur. What's going to be the breaking point? That's going to determine a lot. I haven't said it for a long time, but I'm not one of these people like Kimball who fears a civil war. I don't think that there would be such a thing as a civil war, because I don't think people care enough about preserving the unity of the several states to engage in something as silly as a civil war. The reason why there was a civil war in the 1860s is because the Lincoln administration wanted to preserve the Union. That is why they chose to, attack the South. It wasn't, initially to free the slaves. That became something later, and that was a punitive measure. It was a way of punishing, the Southern slaveholders who held the political and economic power in the South, and of course were responsible for the secession of the Southern states. So it was very clear the goal and the rallying cry of the Union was unity. But that's not the case here with the modern regime in Washington. These are not people who care about unity. Biden's speech made that abundantly clear. Biden divided the country in his own speech into two Americas. He was not making, this was no house divided against itself cannot stand speech. Lincoln condemned this idea that there were two Americas. He wanted to make one united nationalistic empire. Joe Biden doesn't want that. Joe Biden wants to eradicate and expunge so-called MAGA America from the real America that he sees. And so to me, things will get serious when we start having mainstream conversations about a national divorce, which is the only rational solution to all this. Eventually, people will get tired of fighting. They will get tired of living in a dysfunctional country that is hopelessly divided. And so, ultimately, when people get tired of this, they are going to realize that the only solution to a hopelessly divided country is to divide it once and for all into two relatively cohesive countries at the very least. As I've said in the past, my ideal is many, many more than two. But we are still very much progressing in that direction. We're not retreating from that position at all. The risk of that only grows every month. But these things happen in excruciatingly slow motion. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.